James Carter lived alone in his mansion, surrounded by gold-framed furniture, bright lighting, and millions of dollars worth of artwork. To outsiders, he was the epitome of success, a man who had everything a man could want. He was the richest man in town, known for his vast empire and luxurious lifestyle. But behind the grand gates of the estate, James lived a quiet life with no one to share his wealth or his stories with. How could someone who seemed to have it all, money, power, and fame, be so lonely? It's a story about the hidden value of wealth, the sacrifices in the pursuit of success, and the vanity that sometimes hides behind a beautiful exterior. This is not a rags to riches story, but a story of knees to riches. James wasn't born rich. He grew up in a small house on the edge of town, in an area where dreams often lived, dreams. His parents worked hard, but life was hard. As a child, James would lie in bed at night, listening to his parents argue about unpaid debts and wondering why their lives were so difficult. In that moment, James silently vowed he would avoid poverty, no matter what. He started out as a child, mowing lawns and selling lemonade stands, always looking for ways to make money. By the time he reached high school, James had started a part-time job and was making money by selling products he bought at flea markets. He wasn't the smartest kid in class, but his determination made him stand out. His teachers praised him for his driving, but few understood the importance of the responsibility he had. James wasn't just driven, he was also determined to prove that he could have a better life than the one he was born into. As he grew up, his ambitions grew. He read business books, read books about self-made rich people, and studied wealthy people he admired. For James, success is not just a goal, but also a way of knowing. This describes him. He believed that money could solve everything, conflicts, depression, and the feeling of worthlessness that he had suffered for so long. James's first big break was starting a small technology company in the early days of the dot-com boom. While others hesitated, unsure of the future, James kept his head down. He worked day and night, often skipping meals and sleeping in his office. His tireless efforts paid off. Within a few years, his company had grown into a multi-million-dollar business, and investors were flocking to partner with him. By the time he turned 35, James was already a billionaire. He had fulfilled a dream that most people only dream about. He bought the biggest house in town, filled it with the most luxurious cars, and traveled to exotic places by private jet. But even as he built his empire, cracks began to appear in his life. James no longer sees his family. His parents had been a great support, but they were now a distant memory. His childhood friends had stopped calling him, tired of being ignored or abandoned. The relationship had been short-lived and commercial, people were attracted to his money, not him. But James didn't notice, or he chose not to. He was too busy chasing the next big thing, the next event, the next opportunity to prove himself. Loneliness crept in slowly, like a shadow he could not escape. At first, he fought back. "This is the price of victory," he said to himself. But as the years passed, the emptiness became harder to ignore. James began to realize that the big house he had dreamed of as a child was now like a barricaded prison. His hard-earned wealth can't bring back the time he's lost or the connections he's lost. So James Carter, the richest man in town, can't help but ask himself the question he's always avoided: was it all worth it? This is the beginning of his story, a journey that explores the highs and lows of his life, the choices he's made, and the truth about the value of wealth. What you're about to discover could change your perception of success forever. James Carter's financial rise was extraordinary. He didn't just climb the ladder of success, he created it. By the time he was 35, he was appearing in magazines and interviews. People admired him, envied him, and saw him as an idol. However, as the world celebrated his achievements, James began to feel the pressure of the life he had created for himself. At first, he didn't notice. He's too busy to think about anything but work. His mobile phone is constantly ringing with calls from clients, investors, and the media. Every day they have meetings, tasks, and decisions. Evenings are also often spent looking at spreadsheets or making plans for the next big project. Sleep had become a precious commodity he couldn't afford, and even when he closed his eyes, his mind kept racing. James told himself that all this was temporary. Once he reached a certain level of success, everything would be calm. But the truth was, the higher he climbed, the harder life became. With each new event came new expectations, new responsibilities, and new challenges. Victory wasn't the finish line he envisioned, it was a stepping stone that never stopped. His relationships with people began to deteriorate. James had always been close to his parents, especially his mother, who had always encouraged him even when his dreams seemed impossible. But as the company grew, he gradually went home. The calls turned into texts, and then into silence. He told himself that he would understand, that he was doing this to them. But deep down he knew it wasn't so. The truth was, he was so focused on his goals that he didn't have time to achieve them. His friendships were going the same way. His friends who had grown up with him, the ones who had helped him when he had nothing, began to feel like strangers. James didn't return their phone calls, and even if he did, he didn't mind and was always in a hurry to get back to work. Little by little, he stopped talking to me. James noticed, but he didn't try to respond. They won't understand my life now, he told himself. They don't understand my oppression. Romantic relationships are temporary. James had dated several women over the years, but none had lasted. His work is always the most important thing to him, and no one can compare to him. There was a woman named Sarah, whom he loved very much. She was kind, patient, supportive. James thought he was everything. But even he couldn't bridge the gap between them. After months of failure, late nights at the office, and broken promises, Sarah left. Her parting words haunt him, "James, you are married to your job." James didn't deny it. He knew he was right. But instead of facing reality, he drowned himself in his work. If only he could be more successful, more accomplished, then maybe the emptiness he felt would disappear. He convinced himself that wealth and success could fill the void, even if the gap grew larger every year. But no matter how much money he made or how many awards he received, the emptiness remained. His luxurious home, once a symbol of all his achievements, now felt cold and lifeless. He could walk through its magnificent halls, past its rare paintings and gleaming violins, and feel nothing. The house was silent, save for the sound of the polite but distant footsteps of the staff. James often wondered if they pitied him. It wasn't just her house that was empty, it was her entire life. He'd spent so much time chasing success that he'd forgotten why he wanted it in the first place. The joy and excitement he'd felt at the beginning of his career had faded, replaced by depression, exhaustion, and feelings of isolation. James began to question everything. What? Is this really what he'd worked so hard for? Was this the life he dreamed of as a child, waking up in his small bedroom and imagining a future full of wealth and success? He has everything he ever wanted, but he can't shake the feeling that he lost something most important along the way. That night was the hardest. Alone in his large bedroom, surrounded by luxury, James lies awake and thinks about the choices he's made. He thinks about his parents, who have grown old without him. He thought about Sarah and the life they could build together. He thought about the friends he had left behind, the times he had missed, the times he would never get back. For the first time in his life, James began to wonder if he had done something wrong. He had spent years believing that success was the ultimate goal, but now he wasn't so sure. What was the point of everything if there was no one to share it with? The realization was painful, but it couldn't be ignored. James Carter, the richest man in town, was beginning to understand that wealth could buy many things, but it couldn't buy happiness, love, or time. And as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, James found himself haunted by one lingering question: what? James tried to push the thought away. Dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything, he told himself. He became more involved in his work, hoping that the distraction would end the annoying voices in his head. The offers would increase, the risks would increase, and the stakes would increase. But with each successive success, the emptiness inside him deepened. He began to see things he had never seen before. James felt out of place at company events with employees and business partners. They were in groups of 3 or 5, talking and laughing, but he stood alone, drinking from a glass of expensive wine. People respected him, even praised him, but no one understood him. The conversations were polite but external, always at work. James began to realize that wealth brought him power, but it also created a wall between him and the world. The moment of enlightenment became hard to ignore. One night, James was flipping through channels in his empty living room when he came across an old movie he had watched with his family. It was nothing special, just a simple family comedy, but it was still a hit. He remembered laughing with his mother and father on the floor as a child, wrapped in the blanket they shared. A small memory in this world means much more than all the achievements he has accumulated over the years. He turned off the TV and sat silently, staring at the blank screen. There is a great sadness in my heart. James was not with him in his last moments. He was completing an important assignment in Europe when his mother called to tell him the time had come. By the time he arrived, it was too late. His father's last words were not to him, but to the nurse. James did not think much about the forgotten things, but he still carried their weight. His mother was in her late 80s and lived in a small house a few villages away. She had always been proud of James, bragging about his success to anyone who would listen. But lately on the phone he had sounded distant, almost resigned. James realized he couldn't remember the last time she had visited him. He told himself she was busy, but deep down he knew the truth. She hadn't seen him because it made him feel guilty. He doesn't want her money, he wants it. And dropped it. James thought of Sarah trying to pull him over the edge before it was too late. He had been right about everything. He had chosen his job over her, thinking that he would always find time to hang out later. But later never came. He wondered where she was now. Is he happy? Has he thought about her? The thought crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. What can I say? Is he sorry he left her? He realizes it's the best thing in his life, but too late. He doubted he'd listen. The change came one cold November evening. James had just returned home from a long day at the office, and the house was cold and quiet. As he walked in the front door, he noticed something on the table in the foyer. It was a box neatly wrapped in purple paper. He picked it up suspiciously and saw that it was a letter in his mother's hand. It said, "For James." Inside the box was a photo album. James sat down and opened it, his hands shaking slightly. The first page was a picture of him as a baby, lying in his mother's arms. The second page was a picture of him and his father fishing at sea. Page by page, memories were created, birthdays, family vacations, holidays spent together. Each picture was a reminder of a life left behind. Inside the album, James found a letter in the middle. The letter was written in his mother's beautiful hand, and when he opened it he felt a lump in his throat. The letter was not long, but it was enough to make him fall. Dear James, I know you are very busy and your work is very important. But I want to remind you of one thing. Life is made up of moments, not things. The most important thing is the time we spend with those we love. I miss you, James. I hope you find those moments again one day. Tears streamed down James's cheeks as he read more words. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the choice he had made. He remembered the good times he had at board meetings and business meetings. He thought of the people he had pushed away as he relentlessly pursued success. He imagined the life he had dreamed of as a child, a life full of love, laughter, and connection. At some point in his life he had forgotten this dream. That night James could not sleep. He sat in his large living room, photo album in his lap, wondering what he could do to change things. It was impossible to go back and change the past, but maybe, just maybe, it was not too late to start over. The next morning James woke with a rare clarity of consciousness. Her mother's letters and the photo album had touched something deep inside her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't in a rush to get to work or check her email. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, sipped her coffee, and thought about the most important things. Her regrets still weighed heavily, but now there was something else, a glimmer of hope. She decided to start small. That night he called his mother. When he answered the phone, his voice was a little surprised but also a little warm. as if he had been expecting her to call. "James," he said, "it's been a long time. How are you?" I missed you. I thought I might come over this weekend." With a slight tremor, she replied, "Yes, James. I want to." The call ended, and James felt an unusual sense of relief. It's a small step, but it feels significant. For years he had convinced himself that he was too busy to spend time with his family, but now he found time slipping away. That weekend, James went to his mother's house for the first time in years. As he pulled into the garage, memories of his childhood came flooding back. The house was smaller than he remembered, but it was as warm and welcoming as ever. His mother reached out her hand, opened the door, and smiled. He looked old and frail, but there was still a kindness in his eyes that made her feel close to him. They spent the day talking, reminiscing, and laughing. His mother showed him old photographs and told him forgotten stories from her childhood. James listened with sadness and gratitude. He knew how much he had missed, how many good times he had wasted. But for the first time in a long time, he felt connected to something real, something meaningful. Over the next few weeks, James worked hard to change. He began contacting his old friends, apologizing for the way he had let their relationships fade. While others hesitated to contact him again, unsure if his intentions were genuine. But others welcomed him back with open arms, happy to see someone they once knew. A friend, David, was very close to James in his early years. They grew up together, dreamed of the future, and shared their struggles. But as James' career progressed, their friendship faded. When James called him, David was skeptical. "Why now, James?" he asked. "Why are you still fighting after all these years?" James took a deep breath. "Because I made a mistake, David. I thought success would make me happy, but I was wrong. I miss having people in my life who really know me. And you are one of those people." There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then David finally said, "Okay, James. Let's have coffee. But I won't hesitate, I have a lot to say." The meeting was awkward at first, but as they talked, the years flew by. James listened as David shared his frustration and heartache, and for the first time, James didn't try to defend himself. He just listened. Toward the end of their conversation, David smiled and said, "It's nice to see you again, James. Don't wait another 10 years for your next coffee. These small steps start to add up." James found that the more he focused on rebuilding relationships, the more important his wealth became. He still runs his business, but it no longer takes up his attention. He delegated more responsibility to his team and trusted them to handle the day-to-day operations. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to slow down. But the journey wasn't easy. There are times when old habits creep in, the urge to check his phone during a conversation, the temptation to prioritize work over personal commitments. Every now and then, James thinks back to the letters from his mother and the emptiness he feels in his home. He didn't want to go back to that life. One day, while cleaning out his home office, James finds a box of old memorabilia. Inside, he finds a stack of letters from Sarah, the woman he loves and has lost. As he reads them, he is deeply touched by her words of encouragement, her faith in him, and her hope for their future. He realizes how much he has taken her for granted and how much he cares about her. For a few days, James was reluctant to call her. After all this time, did she still want to hear from him? What would she say? He finally decided to write her a letter, not to ask for anything, but to ask for forgiveness and to thank her. He poured his heart into the letter, admitting his mistakes and thanking her for the love she had given him. It didn't matter to James whether she answered or not. The letter was written to end the relationship and relieve him of the guilt he had carried for so long. A small but giant step toward healing. Once the richest man in town, James Carter has come to realize that true wealth isn't measured in money or possessions. It's in the people who care about you, the moments that bring you joy, the connections that give your life meaning. For the first time in years, James felt like he was on the right track. As James continued to reflect on himself and his relationships, he realized that every step he took was taking him in unexpected directions. He began to notice the things he had ignored for years, the little details that made life beautiful. The sound of birds singing outside the window on a bright, sunny day, the warmth of a heartfelt conversation. These were insignificant things to him, but now he saw that they were priceless. One afternoon, James visited a community center in the town where he grew up. It was a white building, nothing like the fancy offices and hotels he had used before, but it felt like a place with a purpose. He had donated money to the public relations office a few years ago, but this time he wasn't there to show off. He wanted his contributions to make an impact and to connect with the people his money was benefiting. He was greeted warmly by the staff, but many seemed surprised that he had come in person. They introduced him to some of the kids in special education there, and their family backgrounds were as difficult as his own. James sat with a group of people and listened to their dreams and struggles. He saw himself in their eager faces, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with money. After James left, he realized something important: his wealth was neither good nor bad. It was merely a tool, and its value depended on how it was used. It took him many years to build his empire, but now he wants to use it to build something more, a history of kindness and generosity. This realization began a new chapter in James' life. He began investing his wealth in meaningful causes, providing scholarships for underprivileged students, supporting small businesses, and restoring underprivileged communities. These efforts connected him with people from all walks of life, people who remembered him for the person he had forgotten. One of them was Maria, a single mother who ran a small bakery in town. Her business during difficult times and James's donations helped her stay afloat. When James came to the bakery to check on her progress, he was impressed by her perseverance and strength. Maria was the kind of person who exuded warmth and positivity even in the face of challenges. She was grateful for her support, but James felt he should thank her. Mary's story was still in his heart. She knew that happiness did not lie in wealth, but in the simple pleasures that came from doing what she loved and taking care of her family. James slowly began to understand this truth: happiness is not in how much you get, but in how much you give. As time went on, James's life changed. Despite his best efforts, the relationship he had neglected began to improve. His mother, who had seemed distant in his life, was now the center of his attention. They spent weekends together, cooking, talking, and revisiting places James had visited as a child. He often laughed that his son had returned, and to James, hearing those words was more precious than any gift he had ever received. His old friend, David, had visited him many times in his life. They would have coffee or dinner together, reminiscing about their childhood and reminiscing about the past. James cherished this time very much, now realizing that true friendship is not easy, but about supporting each other no matter what. While James was building his personal life, his professional career began to change. He was no longer chasing every job or fighting for every inch of the market. Instead, he focused on projects that aligned with his new values, goals that put people first, above short-term profit, beyond short-term stability. Some of his colleagues were skeptical, even critical, of his change of focus, but James didn't care. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was doing something really big. Despite James' success, he still has regrets. This picture and his mother's constant messages reminded him of a time that could never be repeated. He knows some wounds can't be healed, some relationships can't be repaired. But he decided to give it more time. One day, James received a letter. His heart began to beat faster when he recognized the letters Sarah had written. He had not expected to receive a reply to the letter he had sent, and for a moment he considered opening it. When he finally finished, he read the words slowly, savoring each one. Sarah described her life, what she had been through, and how she had built her family. She was happy, but she was also happy with what she had written and her honesty. She forgives him not because she has to, but because she believes he has changed. "I hope you find the peace you seek," she wrote. "I hope you know it's not about the money. It's always about the love you give or don't give." In the past, they gave her a heart she never wanted. Sarah's forgiveness felt like a gift to him, allowing him to let go of the guilt he had carried for so long. James Carter was once the richest man in town, but his wealth no longer defined him by that. He found something more precious, the connection that gave life meaning, the joy of helping others, and the peace of mind that came from knowing he was no longer alone. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was where he was meant to be. As time went by, James Carter's life changed in ways he never expected. His mornings, once filled with small talk and quick phone calls, were now quieter and more purposeful. Every morning he would sit on his balcony, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise over the city he once saw as a stepping stone to his empire. Now he sees it differently. The streets and buildings hold memories, connections, and stories that shaped him even if he ignored them for a long time. James no longer uses his days off to work. Instead, he filled his free time with visits to his mother's house, dinners with old friends, and volunteering at community centers. He revels in the simple things, the moments he once thought were unimportant. He began teaching at the center to share his knowledge of business and entrepreneurship with young people. At first, they were afraid of him, Mr. Carter, the billionaire. But as time went on, they saw a side of him, patient, encouraging, and wanting to see them succeed, but not at the expense of their happiness. The student was a young man named Marcus, who stood next to James. Marcus reminded him of himself, ambitious, driven, determined to get out of trouble. But unlike James, Marcus was not willing to give up everything to realize his dream. He often talked about working 2 jobs to support his mother and take care of his sister. Marcus' love for his family inspired Jacob and gave him hope for the next generation. One day, after the seminar, Marcus asked James a question. "Mr. Carter," he asked, "if you could go back in time, would you make the same choice?" Jacob paused, the question hanging in the air. The emptiness of possession he felt when he reached the pinnacle of success, but he also thought about the lessons he had learned, the growth he had achieved, and the relationships he was rebuilding. Do everything. But I think the most important thing I've learned is this: success means nothing when it comes at the expense of the people you love. If there's one thing I could tell my younger self, it would be to cherish those relationships. They really do make life meaningful. He said Jacob spent a lot of time in the community and he began to feel like he belonged with the people who had troubled him for so many years. Instead, his home became a gathering place for the people he cared about, friends, family, and colleagues who shared his vision for a better, more compassionate world. The laughter and conversation that had once echoed in his head now filled his entire house. James also took steps to make his life easier. He sold some of his properties, including several vacation homes he rarely visited. Instead of accumulating more money, he began to focus on adventure, traveling to places he'd always dreamed of, but this time with a purpose. He would go to small villages, meet people from different cultures, and listen to their stories. Each trip gives him a new perspective on the world and himself. One of her most unusual trips was to a rural village in Southeast Asia, where she met a group of women who ran a hand-woven textile company. They shared stories of how their work has helped their children go to school and grow their communities. Inspired, James decided to join them, using his resources to help them grow their business and ensure they maintained ownership and control. It was nothing like what he had experienced before in the military, but he was more grateful than ever. As time went on, James realized that the changes in his life were not just external, but internal as well. He is not a man who sees success as the only path to success. He learned to appreciate kindness, love, and cooperation. He found joy in giving without expecting anything in return because he became a part of the lives of those important people. One quiet evening, James was sitting on the porch of his childhood home, porch that was neat and tidy and covered with family photos, when his mother came over with 2 cups of tea. He sat next to her and smiled. "James, you've come a long way," he said. "I'm proud of who you have become." James looked out at the playground like a child, chasing a seemingly distant dream. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he said. "You've been so good. Life isn't about what you have, it's about who you share it with." His mother reached out and touched him. "It's never too late to learn," he whispered. James Carter, a man famous for his treasures, has found something very important. His life was measured not by the amount of his wealth or the success of his career, but by the depth of his relationships and the impact his actions had on others. The richest man in town discovers a treasure that money can't buy, his first true sense of peace. As James Carter continued his journey of innovation and transformation, he found himself pondering the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He had spent years building a fortune and a reputation, but now he realized that those things were fading. What mattered most was the impact he could make on someone else's life, a sign that he could go out into the world, not with money, but with meaning. While walking through the town square one day, James saw a group of young men gathered for a moment. They demonstrated how to overcome challenges, and their energy and enthusiasm were infectious. James stood on the side of the crowd watching the actors bring their stories to life. It reminded him of his younger self, full of imagination and dreams, but circumstances weighed him down. After the show, James contacted the band to find out more about them. They are part of a youth group that helps underprivileged youth explore their talents in art. The leader of the group, a woman named Eleanor, explained that most of the children come from difficult situations, poverty, broken homes, and struggle with mental health problems. The program gave them a purpose and a way to express their ideas. James had an immediate impact on their work. "How can I help?" he asked Eleanor. He hesitated, unsure if his request was genuine. But when James told his story, how he had grown up in such an environment and how he had failed in his efforts, she knew what he meant. Over the next few months, James joined the group. He donated money to expand their operations, but he didn't give up. He attended their training sessions, gave advice to the young people, and even told them his story, hoping to inspire them to follow their dreams without forgetting their importance. A young man named Ethan stood before James. Ethan was shy and reserved, but he had a gift for writing. When James encouraged him to show his work, Ethan thought, "It's not enough, people don't care him." And after a while he started to come out of his shell. When the group put together their next big project, it featured a play Ethan had written, a moving story about a boy who finds strength in his path. The play moved the audience to tears, and Ethan was well received. James looked to his right, his heart swelling with pride. He realized that such a moment was more successful than the company he had just closed. As James' involvement in the community grew, so did his reputation. But this time, it wasn't because of his wealth or business acumen, but because of his generosity and willingness to give back. People who had previously viewed him as aloof and unapproachable now viewed him as a deeply thoughtful person. These changes didn't stop James. He had spent his life seeking glory through power and success, but he learned that true glory comes from compassion and humility. James went on with his life. His relationship with his mother grew stronger, and he often accompanied her to community events, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her. Friends became an integral part of his life, and their laughter filled his empty home. Although Sarah's memory was still fresh, James took comfort in knowing that Sarah was happy and had forgiven him. One evening, James sat in his study, surrounded by papers and letters from those he had helped, and he began to write. At first he had no idea what to write about. It was more of a performance than a job. But as the words came out of his mouth he realized he was telling this story. It was not only the story of his success but also the story of the mistakes he made, the regrets he made, and the lessons he learned along the way. The writing process was fun, and when James was done he decided to share his work with the world. The book, The Value of Wealth, A Journey to Discover What Really Matters, became an unexpected success. Readers from all walks of life have found comfort and inspiration in the truth of this story. This book doesn't offer advice or answers, it simply shows that it's never too late to change, connect, and find meaning. James' new goals have brought him a level of fulfillment he's never experienced before. He hasn't spent his days chasing money, greater power, or fame. Instead, they are filled with moments of true connection and happiness. He spends his time mentoring young entrepreneurs, doing community service and spending time with his loved ones. Over the years, James Carter's name has become synonymous not with wealth but with generosity, compassion, and perseverance. The richest man in town has become one of the most popular, not because of what he has, but because of what he gives. And that evening, as James sat on a bench in the town square and watched the children play and the family gather, he felt a peace he had never felt as a child. He knew that his journey was not just about making ends meet or finding redemption, it was about finding himself. For the first time, James understood the true meaning of abundance, a life filled with love, connection, and purpose. And in that moment, he knew he had found it. As James Carter sat on his chair and watched the world around him, he smiled, the smile that speaks of a man who has found what he is looking for. He realized that his wealth was not measured by the zeros in his bank account, but by the lives he had lived and the relationships he had forged. His journey taught him that true success is not what you get, but what you give. His story reminds us all, no matter how far you have traveled, it is never too late. It is never too late to reconnect, rebuild, and find purpose in the things that matter. The greatest treasures in life are not material possessions, they are found in love, kindness, and the time we spend with those who matter most. If James Carter's story has touched your heart, please take a moment to reflect on your own life. Who is most important to you? Do you sometimes let them slip away? It's never too late to reach out, make a change, or take action toward a meaningful life. If this story has inspired you, I invite you to join our Ethan Lord Story community. Here, we share stories that remind us of life's most profound truths, stories that inspire, heal, and connect us all. Subscribe to Ethan Lord Stories and let's experience an impressive, gripping story together. Let this story be your light. Because life is not just about what we have, but who we are. Thank you for watching, and remember that your story is still being written. Do what needs to be said.